Hi, and welcome to Energy Today podcast. This is Tech Tuesday. Today we're going to talk about Frac-Hits in North Dakota. Let's get started. So today we're going to talk about an article by Trent Jacobs in JPT, and the title of the article is Data from 17,000 Wells Tells a New Tale of Bakken Oil Boosting Frac-Hits. So this is kind of a summary of a couple of technical papers from some A&M University professors, and from what I can tell, it's kind of based on big data analysis. And I think that they have reached a few wrong conclusions on this article. So let's go through it, talk about what they got right and what I think that they got wrong, and why North Dakota is ripe for certain versions of refrac that can be tremendously successful. The first point that they have made is that well-to-well interactions in North Dakota stand out in a big way from those in other unconventional plays. Whereas frac-hits are generally positive or generally negative in most basins in the world, for some reason they're positive in North Dakota. And then the next thing is over the years, a question has lingered as to why. So we're going to get into some reasoning that really goes counter with what the article says, and why I think that they have totally missed the point on this. And I think that the main thing that this brings out is when you go to do analysis on big data and data mining with really no technical background or no background other than reservoir and data analysis, sometimes you kind of miss the point. By the end of this, hopefully you'll have an idea of where I think that North Dakota probably has the best opportunity for positive refrac, and I've got some experience to back that up as well. It's the reason why Bakken operators have historically not seen much production loss from parent-child effects is because their initial completion design were small, suboptimal, and understimulated. But there's actually quite a bit more to the story, and I'll kind of get to that more at the end, but I first kind of want to go through what their rationale is for what they are thinking here in this article. Next part, among the study's biggest insights is that most beneficial frac-hits were seen in parent wells with proppant loading of less than 450 pounds per lateral foot. And that's 83% of all parent wells in the Bakken that fall below this critical threshold. So now they're immediately going to proppant loading. That is a mistake in the Bakken. That is not the key item. Ultimately, proppant loading has a positive impact, but here we go, just immediately jumping to proppant loading. And to give you some background, I went to Houston, Texas to sit in on a fracturing conference with some experts. It was an open conference with a room full of engineers, and the guy up front got up and said one thing: the only correlation to high productivity wells is proppant loading and total fluid volume. And not a single person in the entire room got up and said a word. No one objected. No one said, what about proppant placement? What about limited entry? What about perf clusters? What about open hole versus cased hole versus cemented? What about depleted nearby wells? No, a whole room full of probably 200 people, no one said a word about it. So that's where our industry is now. We kind of take a generic look at a lot of these factors, and that was it. No one challenged him. I think that at that point in time, I thought our industry's in trouble. But here we go again. It immediately goes to proppant loading, which in essence could be part of the problem, but it is not the main reason why these frac-hits are causing success in the Bakken. And then it talks about most of the understimulated parent wells were completed between 2010 and 2015. I'm going to tell you that there's a ton of wells in Montana and the early North Dakota that comes before these wells that probably represent some of the best opportunity for reentries in all of North Dakota, and I'll tell you the reasons why as well. So now we get to the next comments, and additional context is found in the fact that the Bakken was the first tight oil play. That is true. A lot of learning took place on the Bakken. A lot of things were done right, but it was early times. Technology was very limited. Stage count was limited. Lateral length initially were 1 mile laterals, and during this time period, they went to 2 mile laterals, which again put a strain on the technology. Primarily, that was open hole ball drop systems with 2 different styles of packers being used depending on the operator. So yeah, they are right. The Bakken was part of the learning curve. There was a lot going on in Canada at the same time, and these were probably the earliest learning curves were North Dakota and were Canada. So then the article talks about how they're kind of running out of parent-child well situations. I think that this needs to be looked at in a different fashion, and it has to do with how the original wells were completed. Most of the Bakken's understimulated parents were completed between 2010 and 2015. That's simply not true. There was a whole bunch of drilling that was taking place prior to 2010, and then in that time period, things began to kind of shift and change, but there was a lot of evolution even during that time period. So typical prop loading during this time was 200 to 400 pounds per foot, and by 2016 it was 900 pounds per foot, and kind of remains in that neighborhood today. That's good to know. 900 is probably optimum based upon the amount of work that's been done in the Bakken. So let's just say that they probably have that right, and that would be a reasonable assumption or a reasonable goal to aspire for. They then start to talk about well spacing, and I'm going to kind of stay out of that because I don't have the data to support what the proper well spacing is. I have seen a recent SPE talk that talked about in one unconventional oil formation the ability to drill 4 wells per section, 6 wells per section, or 8 wells per section, and a lot of that came down to permeability, and what the optimum was depended on where you were in the reservoir. But fascinating stuff. Some of the wells, they were able to pretty much get full depletion in less than 2 years based on the numbers that I saw in that presentation. But here in North Dakota, I do not know what the current spacing is, and I know the earlier spacings were pretty large, which should allow you to do parent wells. So that is probably the other question, is if you wanted to go to tighter spacing near an existing parent well, is there a methodology to go about that? And I will save that for an entirely separate discussion on how I think that can be done successfully. So then the statement is, and they are talking about refracking parent-child wells, and I'll just read it. However, the results reported by EERC do not add up to a strong endorsement of the practice for mitigation reasons. They suggest refracking can be a mitigation tool, but only at relatively tight spacing, and even then the net impact may be unimpressive. That is totally wrong, I believe, for this situation, especially in the earlier completed wells. These wells are ripe with opportunity for refrac, but it won't look like it did or it does in the Eagle Ford or in the Permian or any of the existing basins, because the North Dakota represents a significant option for refracking that isn't seen in any of those other basins. So now I will talk a little bit about refracking and why in my opinion, North Dakota is seeing increases in production with Frac-Hits, and you're not going to see that in the Eagle Ford, in the Permian, things like that. And most of the reason has to do with how the original wells were completed up until the oil price crash and everybody switched to cemented liners. And that is that all of these wells were completed open hole, and that's the problem with big data. Is you try to compare this study to the Permian or to the Eagle Ford or to Niobrara. There's some similarities with Niobrara and some opportunity there as well, but the difference with these wells is they're all open hole completed. So if you do a frac and it intersects another well, you will get productivity. If you're fracking against a cemented liner in the offsetting well, you're not going to see any increase in productivity. You might see a collapse in casing or something gets filled with sand, but every frac that intersects the existing well has the potential to add production. I don't think that that is the way that this should be approached. I think that's interesting, but you can't build a company or economics on that. So now I'm going to talk about why or where there is huge opportunity in the Bakken, and I'll talk about a couple of things that I have seen or worked with. The first was that I used to work for a company that had open hole ball drop systems. That was their mainstay, and I would go down to Denver and I would talk to the operators in the Bakken, and they would say, "Hey Dan, Marathon is getting 1,500 barrels a day IP, and those wells are performing great. I don't need mechanical diversion. I don't need a liner. I can just frac open hole." That was true. IPs were great, but the Marathon wells would come on like gangbusters, decline immediately, and have really no ultimate recoveries that were of any significance. So I actually was involved with a refrac project where it was, okay, we think we have a problem here. What we did is actually went in, determined where the fracs were, and they claimed that pressures were going up and down during the entire frac, and that indicated new breakdowns. All these wells had one or two fracs. That was all they had. So basically on the reentry, we went in, determined where those fracs were. We were able to isolate them and then perform refrac. They got like new production. So any well that was fracked open hole is the first choice. The second is any well that was fracked with sand slug diversion. So I talked to one of the engineers in Canada on a major project. He told me that one of the consulting companies out of Denver had totally convinced them that sand slug diversion was the way to go. And so instead of verifying, and this is why our industry is really bad at doing field trials, instead of verifying how many fracs you're actually getting. So for example, do sand slug diversion, that's great. But afterwards, go in with a camera and determine actually how many fracs that you're getting. But the engineer that I was talking to, I think his name was Kevin, shows me a chart, and he shows me an increase in frac pressure every time they would dump a sand slug down. And I told him, I said, you're just increasing entry pressure. He was totally convinced that they were creating new fracs through the entire wellbore. So a mile long lateral, and once again, any well that was done with sand slug diversion, you should go take a look at it. There's huge opportunity to go in, and some of these were in the best part of the reservoir, but there's huge opportunity to go in and refrac those wells if you use the methodology that we used at this one point in time. These wells perform like brand new drilled wells. They were great success stories. Every one of them that was done was a success. And then the last one is kind of company specific, and that was wells that were completed by Brigham that I think ultimately got bought by Statoil that I don't even know who owns them now. But Brigham, for a period of time, decided to run blast joints for isolation. And anybody that has done engineering calculations knows that you can pump past a blast joint in a 6-inch hole at 100 barrels a minute all day long. I'm going to tell you, every well that was done by Brigham probably has 1 or 2 fracs in, just like the original Marathon wells. And so these are great opportunities to take a look. If you wanted to go into a parent well and you wanted to refrac, and you wanted even to drill offsetting wells and refrac, there is a methodology that you can do to make sure that your child wells are, successful. So I will, in the next segment, talk about I will talk about refrac, specifically how to do it in North Dakota. You're not going to cement a liner. You're not going to run an internal liner. There's a very specific methodology that will almost guarantee you like new results on these wells. But we'll save that for next time. I think the article overall in JPT was good for discussions, but they got it totally wrong in their conclusions. And part of it is if you're in a university at A&M and you're not in the field, you haven't seen the historical context of the development in North Dakota. It's a pretty cool place, loaded with opportunity, and also the ability potentially to change, the nature of well spacing, as well as potential for refracs, is probably the best in the Bakken of anywhere in the world, as I know it right now. Okay, thanks a lot. That's Energy Today podcast. And sorry, I've been kind of offline for a bit because I've been working with the company on some technology development, but I'm back. I'm gonna be posting regularly from now on. That's First Tech Tuesday in a while, so here we go.